What if the mightiest empire the ancient Western world had ever known did not end in a single burning night, but instead grew slowly quiet over the course of 100 years, its lamps dimming one by one, its roads emptying by degrees, its great cities shrinking behind walls that had once seemed unnecessary, until at last a morning arrived when there was simply no longer an emperor in the West for anyone to obey. Tonight, we will walk together through that long and gentle fading. We will follow the story of the Western Roman Empire, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow settling, a gradual loosening of the ties that had once bound half a continent into a single world. We will begin in the years when Rome still believed itself eternal, when its coins passed from hand to hand in markets from the rain-soaked hills of Britain to the warm shores of North Africa, when a traveler could set out from the Atlantic and journey for months across paved roads without ever leaving the shelter of Roman law. And then, quietly, we will trace how that immense and confident world began to soften at its edges, how its armies changed their faces, how its borders shifted like the banks of a slow-moving river, until the very idea of a Western emperor faded away almost without anyone noticing that it had gone. This is not a story of one battle, nor of one great villain, nor of one terrible day. It is the story of how something vast can end so slowly and so gently that most of the people living within it barely felt the change from one year to the next. It is a story with many quiet turning points, many ordinary lives, and a strange and moving truth at its heart, which is that empires do not always fall. Sometimes they simply fade and leave their light scattered across everything that comes after. So find a comfortable place to rest tonight. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let the tension slip from your hands and allow your breathing to slow into something soft and even. There is no need to hurry anywhere. We will move through these centuries at the pace of a quiet evening walk, pausing wherever the story invites us to linger, resting our attention on the small human details that so much of history forgets. Let the sound of these words be like footsteps on an old stone road at dusk, steady and unhurried, carrying you gently down towards sleep. And if you find comfort in these slow journeys through the vanished world, you are welcome to subscribe and return whenever the night feels long or the day has been heavy. There will always be another quiet chapter waiting here for you, another empire to wander through, another candle to watch as it burns slowly down to its last soft glow. But for now, let us step back across 16 centuries into a world that believed it would never end, and begin to understand, gently and without sorrow, why it did. To understand how Rome faded in the West, we must first stand for a while inside its greatness and feel how enormous and how permanent it seemed to the people who lived within it. Picture the empire at its height, in the years around the middle of the 2nd century after the birth of Christ. This was the age that later generations would call the height of the Roman peace, a span of many decades in which the heart of the empire was largely free from the great wars that had once torn the Mediterranean apart. The borders of this empire ran for thousands upon thousands of miles. In the far northwest, Roman soldiers stood watch upon a long stone wall that crossed the whole width of northern Britain, gazing out into the cold mists of the lands beyond, wrapped in wool against the damp, warming their hands over small fires in stone guardhouses. In the south, the empire reached across the whole coast of North Africa, its farms and cities pressing up against the edge of the great desert. In the west lay the wide Atlantic, the end of the known world, and in the east the empire touched the older kingdoms of Persia and the trade roads that carried silk and spice and precious stones from lands so distant that most Romans could only imagine them. Between these far edges lay a world knit together, with a completeness that would not be seen again in Europe for well over 1,000 years after it was gone. The Roman roads were the veins of this world, paved with fitted stone, raised and drained so that they shed the rain, marked at every mile with a carved stone pillar that told the traveler how far he had come, and how far he had come, and how far he had yet to go. These roads ran in long, patient, straight lines across the whole span of the empire, cutting through forests, crossing rivers on arched stone bridges that still stand in some places to this day, climbing over mountain passes and descending into fertile valleys. A merchant could set out from a harbor in Spain and, given enough time and enough coin, reach the frontier of Syria, sleeping each night in a town that used the same money, obeyed the same laws, and spoke, at least in its markets and its offices, a language he could understand. This was a freedom of movement so ordinary to the Romans that they scarcely thought about it. And yet it was one of the quiet miracles of the ancient world, and its slow disappearance would be one of the deepest losses of the age we are about to enter. And then there was the sea. The Romans called the Mediterranean simply our sea, Mare Nostrum, for it lay entirely within their empire, ringed on every shore by Roman land. A ship could sail from one Roman province to another without ever touching a foreign coast. Across these waters moved a constant traffic of goods that bound the empire together in a single vast web of exchange. Great grain ships sailed each year from Egypt and North Africa to feed the enormous population of the capital, their holds heavy with wheat. Riding low in the water as they made the long crossing, wine traveled in tall clay jars and olive oil in rounded amphorae, and fine red pottery packed carefully in straw, and marble cut from distant quarries, and countless smaller things besides, so that a family living in the countryside of Gaul might eat their evening meal from a bowl made in Italy, seasoned with oil pressed from olives grown in Africa, drinking wine from grapes ripened on hillsides they would never see. This was a connected world, and its people, without quite realizing it, depended upon that connection for the shape and comfort of their daily lives. At the center of this world stood the cities, and the cities were the true pride of Rome. The capital itself, at its greatest, may have held close to 1 million people, an astonishing number for the ancient world, so many that simply feeding them and bringing them clean water required a machinery of aqueducts and warehouses and shipping fleets that stretched across the sea. Fresh water flowed into the city through great arched channels that marched across the countryside on their tall stone legs, pouring at last into public fountains and into the enormous public baths where ordinary people, rich and poor alike, could wash away the dust and heat of the day. There were theaters carved into hillsides, and racetracks where crowds roared at the thunder of chariots, and temples rising on their high platforms, and libraries, and markets that never fully fell silent even after dark. And the capital did not stand alone. All across the empire, cities rose in imitation of it, each with its own forum where business was done and news exchanged, its own baths, its own temples, its own straight colonnaded streets. So a merchant arriving in a strange town at the far edge of the empire could still find the familiar shapes of Roman life waiting to greet him. The same civic order, the same comforts, the same reassuring sense that he had not truly left home. Yet the deepest strength of Rome lay not in its stones or its roads or even its armies, remarkable as all of these were. It lay in an idea, and the idea was this. The Romans had learned slowly and often through hard and bloody experience how to fold the peoples they conquered into their own world, rather than simply crushing them. A defeated tribe might, over the course of a few generations, become Roman citizens. A provincial family born far from Italy might send its sons into the army or into public office. And in time those sons might rise to wealth and standing, and their grandsons might sit in the Senate or even, in the end, wear the purple of the emperor himself. Some of Rome's greatest rulers came not from Italy at all, but from Spain, from North Africa, from the provinces at the edges of the empire. And in the early years of the 3rd century, an emperor extended Roman citizenship to nearly all the free people of the empire, so that a man born in a village on the edge of the desert or in a farming settlement in the hills of Britain could call himself a Roman as fully and as proudly as a man born within sight of the Tiber. This was the quiet cement that held so vast a structure together. It was not fear alone, though the legions were real and their discipline formidable. It was also belonging. To be Roman was to be part of something far larger than any single town or tribe or province. A shared world of law and order and civilization that seemed as fixed and as permanent as the stars wheeling overhead. To the people who lived inside this world, its permanence was simply the shape of reality itself, as unquestioned as the rising of the sun. A farmer bending over his rows of wheat in the Italian countryside, a weaver at her loom in a Syrian town, a dock worker heaving sacks of grain onto the quays at the great port of Ostia. None of them ever seriously imagined that the empire might one day cease to be. Empires had risen and fallen before, yes, but those were old stories, the tales of Egyptians and Persians and Greeks, faded legends of a distant past. Rome was not a story. Rome was the present, solid and immediate, the very ground beneath their feet. Its peace had lasted so long that no one alive could remember what it had felt like to live without it. And so they went about their days, buying and selling, marrying and burying, raising their children beneath the wide sky of an empire they believed would stand forever. Let us stay a while longer in that ordinary daily life, for it is the true heart of any history, and it is so easily lost beneath the great names of emperors and generals. What was it actually like to live in the Roman world in its long golden afternoon? It varied enormously, of course, between the wealthy and the poor, between the great cities and the quiet countryside, between one province and another far across the sea. But there were common threads that ran through it all. Most people, then as in almost all of history before the modern age, were farmers. They worked the land as their families had worked it for generations, rising before the first light to tend fields of wheat and barley, groves of gnarled olive trees, and long-ordered rows of vines. Their days were shaped not by clocks, but by the sun and the turning of the seasons, by the great rhythm of plowing and sowing and harvest, by the festivals that marked the passing of the year. Their homes were often simple, of stone or mud brick, warmed by a small hearth whose smoke drifted up through a hole in the roof, lit after dark by the soft flame of an oil lamp. Their lives were hard, bound to the weather and the harvest. But they were also woven into a larger order that gave them a certain steadiness, a certain confidence that the world would go on as it always had. In the cities, the day began early too, in the gray light before dawn, when the bakers had already been working for hours so that fresh bread would be ready as the streets came to life. Water carriers moved through the narrow lanes. Shopkeepers took down the shutters of their little stalls and laid out their goods. The wealthy woke in their spacious houses, built around open courtyards where fountains played and light fell softly upon painted walls, and their households, which often included many enslaved people, began the work of the day. For here we must pause and acknowledge one of the deep shadows that lay beneath all the brightness of Roman life. For the comfort of the Roman world rested to a great degree upon the labor of the enslaved. Slavery was woven so thoroughly into Roman society that most Romans never thought to question it. Enslaved people worked in the fields and the mines, served in the great houses, labored in the workshops, taught the children of the rich, and did much of the hard and hidden work that made Roman civilization possible. It was a cruelty so ordinary that it was almost invisible to those who benefited from it, and it shaped the lives of millions of human beings whose names are almost entirely lost to us now. We cannot tell the story of Rome honestly without holding this truth quietly alongside its glories. The Romans loved their public spaces, and above all they loved the baths. These were far more than places to wash. They were the beating social heart of the city, where people met and gossiped and made bargains, where they exercised and relaxed and passed the warm hours of the afternoon. A person might move slowly from a steaming hot room to a warm one and then plunge into cold water, and afterwards sit and talk with friends in the shade of a colonnade, oiled and scraped clean, feeling the cares of the day dissolve. The theaters drew great crowds to watch comedies and dramas, and the racetracks stirred passions that could rise to a fever, for the people supported their favorite chariot teams with a devotion that sometimes spilled over into rivalry and even violence. There were darker entertainments too, the games of the arena, where men were made to fight and wild beasts were slaughtered for the pleasure of the watching crowds. Another shadow beneath the bright surface of Roman life, though to most Romans these spectacles were simply part of the ordinary fabric of the city. And through all the days and seasons ran religion, though in a form that might feel strange to us now. The traditional gods of Rome, borrowed and blended over the centuries from many peoples, were honored in the great public temples, and also in the small shrines that stood in every home. A family would keep little figures of the household spirits near the hearth, offering them a portion of the meal, a few quiet words, a moment of respect, trusting them to watch over the home and its people. The great temples marked the turning of the year with festivals and processions and sacrifices, filling the streets with color and music and the smoke of offerings. The emperor himself was woven into this sacred order, honored in ways that blurred the line between the earthly ruler and the divine. Yet the empire was also home to countless other faiths, carried along its roads and shipping lanes from every corner of the known world, the worship of gods from Egypt and Persia and the eastern lands, mystery religions that promised their followers secret knowledge and hope beyond death. And among all these, quietly at first, almost unnoticed, a new faith was beginning to spread, carried from person to person, from city to city, in letters and in the testimony of ordinary believers. We will return to that quiet growth in time, for it would come to matter greatly in the long transformation of the Roman world. Hold in your mind, then, this picture of a world that felt whole and unshakable and eternal. Straight roads running to the far horizon beneath a wide and open sky, white cities gleaming beside the blue water of an inland sea, ships crossing between the provinces with their holds full of grain and wine and oil, coins passing from hand to hand in 1,000 markets, each one stamped with the stern profile of an emperor, farmers bent over their fields, children playing in the shade of columns that seemed older than memory itself, families gathered around their small hearths at evening, while the household gods watched over them from their little shrine. This was the Roman world at its height, and to the people who lived within it, there was no reason on earth to imagine that it would ever come to an end. But even in the brightest afternoon, the light begins, so slowly that no eye can catch the moment, to lengthen and to slant toward evening. The shadows grow imperceptibly longer. The warmth begins, very gradually, to fade from the air. And so, gently, the story of Rome moves forward, out of its long golden afternoon, and toward the first quiet gathering of the shadows that would, over many patient years, deepen at last into night. The trouble, when it came, did not arrive with a single dramatic blow, and this is one of the most important things to understand about the whole long story of Rome's fading. There was no one moment when everything changed, no single disaster after which the empire was doomed. Instead, the difficulties came slowly, as a gradual accumulation of many separate strains, each of them manageable enough on its own, but together forming a weight that pressed harder and harder upon the great machinery of the empire, until, over the course of generations, it could no longer bear its own burden in the West. To understand this long weakening, we must turn to a period of crisis that shook the whole empire in the 3rd century after Christ. For it was in those difficult and often chaotic decades that many of the deeper problems first came clearly and painfully into view. For much of its earlier history, Rome had managed the passing of power from one emperor to the next with a rough kind of stability. There had been murders and civil wars, yes, but between them stretched long periods of order, in which the throne passed reasonably smoothly, and the great work of governing the empire went on. But in the 3rd century, that fragile order broke down almost completely. Over a span of roughly 50 years, the empire saw a bewildering and dizzying succession of emperors, one after another, so many that it is hard even to keep their names in memory. Some ruled for only a few months before they were killed. Very few died peacefully in their beds. The throne became a prize to be seized by whichever general could win the loyalty of enough soldiers. And that loyalty in those hard years was too often bought with promises of higher pay and richer plunder. An army on one frontier might proclaim its commander emperor, while at the very same moment an army on another frontier proclaimed a rival, and then the two would march against each other across the provinces, and Roman would fight Roman while the true enemies of the empire watched and waited beyond the borders. This deep instability at the very top of the empire rippled outward into every corner of Roman life. Armies that should have been standing guard upon the frontiers were instead marched back and forth across the empire to fight in civil wars, leaving the borders dangerously thin, and the peoples who lived beyond those borders were watching. Along the great rivers of the north, the Rhine and the Danube, which for so long had marked the edge of the Roman world, various groups pressed harder against the frontier, sometimes raiding across in search of plunder, sometimes seeking to settle within the empire, sometimes both at once. In the east, an old rival rose again with renewed strength, a powerful new Persian dynasty that challenged Rome directly and inflicted upon it, in one bitter moment, a humiliation that would have seemed unthinkable in the confident days of the Roman peace. For a Persian king captured a Roman emperor alive in battle, a disaster whose memory stung Roman pride for generations. And beneath the wars and the raids, quieter and more insidious troubles were gnawing at the very foundations of the Roman world. Money, that invisible lifeblood of the vast Roman economy, began to lose its trustworthiness, to pay for the endless wars and the ever-growing armies. One emperor after another debased the coinage, mixing more and more cheap base metal into coins that had once been made of good silver, so that a coin no longer truly held the value stamped upon its face. And as this went on year after year, prices began to rise, slowly at first, and then more steeply, and people came to trust the money less and less. Trade, which depends entirely upon the shared confidence that a coin accepted today will still be worth something tomorrow, grew harder and more uncertain. In some regions, people began to fall back upon older ways, exchanging goods directly for other goods, rather than trusting the shrinking value of the currency. The great web of commerce that had bound the empire into a single world did not vanish, but it frayed and thinned, and the fraying was felt in every market and every workshop, in the rising cost of bread and cloth, and the small necessities of ordinary life. And then, as if the wars and the raids and the failing money were not enough, disease came as well. In the middle of the century, a devastating plague swept through the empire, moving along the very roads and shipping lanes that had once carried prosperity from province to province. We do not know with certainty what illness it was, for the descriptions that survive in the ancient sources do not match precisely any disease we can name today. But the accounts speak of terrible and widespread suffering, of cities where the dead lay so numerous that there were too few living hands to bury them, of fields left untended because there were no longer enough people to work them. The plague thinned the population across the empire, weakened the army, emptied the countryside, and deepened everywhere the growing sense that the world had somehow slipped out of its proper order, that the old certainties no longer held as they once had. For the ordinary person living through these long and difficult decades, the great crisis of the empire was felt not as grand history, but as a slow and steady tightening of the conditions of daily life. Taxes grew heavier, for the state needed ever more money to pay its soldiers and defend its threatened borders. Roads that had once been perfectly safe now carried a measure of danger, so that travel and trade became more difficult and more costly. And in many places, something happened that would have astonished the Romans of an earlier and more confident age. Cities that had spread out freely and openly for generations, so secure in the great peace of Rome that they had felt no need of defenses, now began, for the first time in living memory, to build walls around themselves. All across the empire, in town after town, people gathered stone, sometimes tearing apart old monuments and tombs to find it, and raised protective walls around their homes and their markets and their temples. Those walls, rising around cities that had long felt no need of them, were a quiet and unmistakable sign of a changing age. They said, without words, that the great open peace of Rome could no longer simply be assumed, that the world beyond the town had grown uncertain, and that safety now had to be built in stone. If you had walked through the empire in those years, you would have seen these new walls rising everywhere, pale and freshly cut, encircling cities that had never before needed them. And you would have understood, without anyone telling you, that something in the world had shifted. And yet, and this is one of the truly remarkable things about the story we are telling, The empire did not fall in the 3rd century. It bent, it strained, it suffered terribly. It very nearly came apart, and yet it did not break. In its hour of deepest crisis, it found within itself the strength and the leadership to endure. A series of tough, capable soldier emperors, many of them risen from humble origins in the frontier provinces, fought to pull the empire back from the edge of dissolution, defeating the invaders, crushing the rival claimants, and slowly restoring a measure of order. And the greatest of these, the man who did more than any other to reshape the empire and give it a new and longer life, was a soldier of humble birth from the lands along the Danube frontier, a man named Diocletian, who took the throne near the very end of that troubled century. His reforms were so vast and so lasting that they would echo through the whole rest of the story we are following. And so it is worth pausing here, in the quiet of the night, to understand what he did and why he did it. Diocletian saw, with the hard, clear eyes of a man who had risen through the ranks of a broken army, that the empire had simply grown too large and too troubled for any one man to govern it alone. The frontiers were too long, the threats too many, the distances too great. A crisis on the Rhine and a crisis on the Persian border might erupt at the same moment, and a single emperor could not possibly be in 2 places at once, nor could orders travel fast enough across the vast empire to meet each danger in time. And so Diocletian made a decision that would shape everything that came after. He divided the rule of the empire, choosing a trusted colleague to rule alongside him as a fellow emperor, and then, in time, appointing 2 junior emperors beneath them, so that 4 rulers governed the different regions of the empire at once, each able to respond swiftly to the threats nearest to him without waiting for word to travel from a distant capital. This arrangement, which later historians would call the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, was meant to bring stability to the dangerous business of succession and strength to the defense of the long and threatened borders. But Diocletian did far more than divide the throne. He reorganized and expanded the army to meet the many threats pressing upon the empire. He broke the provinces into smaller pieces, more of them, and each one smaller, so that they could be governed and taxed more closely, and could not so easily become the power base of an ambitious rebel. He built up a much larger body of officials to manage the taxes and the supplies and the endless administration of so vast a realm. He tried to steady the failing economy, even issuing a famous decree that set maximum prices for a great range of goods across the whole empire, in an attempt to halt the relentless rise in the cost of living. Though that particular measure largely failed, for prices, as every age has learned, are not so easily commanded by decree, and he reshaped the very image of the emperor himself, surrounding the throne with elaborate ceremony and distance and eastern grandeur, so that the ruler became a far more remote and exalted figure than before, less a first citizen among Romans, as the earliest emperors had styled themselves, and more a sovereign lord set high above his subjects, approached with bowed heads and lowered eyes. These great reforms saved the empire in a real sense. They pulled it back from the very edge of dissolution and granted it another long span of life. But they also changed its character in ways that would matter deeply for the story of the West. The empire that emerged from the crisis of the 3rd century was a heavier and more burdensome thing than the one that had entered it. It carried a larger army to feed and pay, a larger bureaucracy to maintain, and a heavier weight of taxation resting upon the shoulders of the ordinary people who had to sustain it all. The state now reached deeper into daily life than it ever had before, binding people ever more tightly to their work and their place, for it needed the farmers to keep farming and the workers to keep working in order to feed the great machine of defense and administration. And so it began to fix people to their occupations and their land, so that a farmer's son must remain a farmer and a baker's son, a baker generation after generation. Some historians have seen in these very changes the seeds of the empire's later weakness in the West, a state grown so costly to maintain that its own people could barely bear the weight of it, while others emphasize how truly remarkable it was that Rome survived the crisis at all, and how much strength the reforms restored. The sources let us see the strain quite clearly, even where they leave the deeper questions of cause open to lasting debate. There is something worth resting with here gently. In the stillness of the night, the empire did not fall when it was struck the hardest. In the chaos and terror of the 3rd century, it found within itself the strength to endure, to transform, and to go on. And this pattern of surviving crisis by changing itself, of bending rather than breaking, would repeat again and again in the long story that lay ahead. Rome in the West would not, in the end, be shattered in a single blow. It would be slowly, gradually, almost gently changed, transformed by degrees over many decades, until one day the thing that remained was no longer quite Rome at all, though the people living within it might scarcely have been able to say when the change had truly happened. The fall, when it finally came, would be less a shattering than a fading, less a great battle lost than a long and quiet letting go. And so, having steadied itself and drawn back from the brink, the empire moved forward into a new age, an age that would be shaped above all by 2 great forces slowly rising within it. The first was the shifting of the empire's whole weight toward the east, away from the ancient heartland of Italy and toward the wealthier, older, more populous lands of the eastern Mediterranean. The second was the quiet and steady rise of that new faith we spoke of before, which in the span of a single long lifetime would move from the persecuted margins of Roman society all the way to the very center of Roman power. To follow the story of the West's long fading, we must now turn to a single remarkable man who embodied both of these great forces at once, a man whose choices would send their echoes rolling down through all the centuries to come. The man who would reshape the entire Roman world was born in the difficult and uncertain years of the late 3rd century, in the lands along the Danube frontier, where the empire met the wild northern world, and his name was Constantine. His father was a soldier of considerable ability who rose, through the years of crisis and reform, to become one of the junior emperors in Diocletian's great system of 4 rulers. And so the young Constantine grew up close to the heart of power, watching the machinery of the newly reformed empire at work, learning from within the hard and dangerous lessons of army and court and politics, in an age when a throne might be won or lost by the loyalty of soldiers and the turning of fortune. He spent time, as a young man, at the courts of the senior emperors, half-honored guest and half-hostage, a common enough arrangement in those wary years. And there he absorbed the workings of imperial rule and measured, with a young man's careful and ambitious eyes, the strengths and the weaknesses of the men who held the world in their hands. When his father died in the far northwest of the empire, in the city that we now call York, in the misty province of Britain, the soldiers who had served the father proclaimed the son emperor in his place. This was in the year 306, and it marked the beginning of a long and patient struggle that would eventually make Constantine the sole master of the Roman world. That struggle is in its details, a story of civil war, of rival emperors maneuvering and marching against one another across the wide provinces of the empire, of alliances made and broken, of battles fought at bridges and river crossings. It would be easy to tell it as a tale of clashing armies and dramatic reversals. But we are not here tonight for the clash of armies. We are here for the slow and quiet turning of history, and the true importance of Constantine lies not so much in how he won his power, as in what he chose to do with it once it was securely in his hands. For Constantine made 2 decisions that would echo down through all the centuries that followed, and would shape the entire remaining story of the Western Roman Empire. He embraced the new faith of the Christians, and he founded a new capital in the East. Let us take each of these in turn, slowly, for each one is a story in itself. Consider first the matter of the faith, for it is one of the great quiet transformations in all of human history, a change so deep and so far-reaching that we are still living within its long consequences today. When Constantine was a young man, Christianity was still a minority religion within the empire, one faith among a great many others, often viewed with suspicion and at times subjected to harsh and violent persecution. The Christians worshipped a single god and refused to honor the traditional gods of Rome, and they would not offer sacrifice to the emperor or to the spirit of the state. To most Romans, this refusal seemed not merely strange but genuinely dangerous, for the peace and prosperity of the empire were thought to depend upon the proper honoring of the gods, and a people who withheld that honor seemed to threaten the sacred order that protected everyone. And so, in waves of persecution that came and went across the decades, Christians were arrested, their gatherings broken up, their sacred writings seized and burned, and some among them were put to death for refusing to abandon their faith. The last and greatest of these persecutions had been launched by Diocletian himself, in the very years when Constantine was coming to manhood, so that the young man would have witnessed with his own eyes the machinery of persecution at its most severe. Yet through all of this, the faith continued quietly to spread. It moved along the same roads and shipping lanes that carried Roman trade, passing from person to person, from household to household, from one city to the next. It spread through the testimony of ordinary believers, through letters carried between small scattered communities, through the care that Christians showed to one another, and even to strangers, tending the sick during times of plague when others fled, caring for the poor and the widowed and the abandoned. It found a home among the humble and the enslaved, but also increasingly among people of standing and education. And it offered something that many in that troubled and uncertain age hungered for, a promise of meaning, of hope beyond the sufferings of this life, of a love that reached even to the lowest and the least. Slowly, quietly, without armies or emperors behind it, the new faith grew. Constantine, according to the traditions that later gathered around his name, came to believe that the Christian God had granted him victory in a crucial battle for control of the empire, a battle fought at a bridge over the Tiber, near Rome itself, in the year 312. The stories tell of a sign he saw, a vision of the cross or a message in the sky. Though the accounts differ in their details and were written down after the fact, colored by later devotion and by Constantine's own needs as a ruler, historians have debated ever since the true nature of his personal belief, how sincere it was, how deep it ran, how much it was faith and how much it was politics. For these things are rarely simple in the hearts of powerful men, and Constantine himself was not baptized until he lay dying, near the very end of his life, a delay that was not unusual in that age. But whatever the true state of his private soul, which we can never fully know, the public consequences of his choice were enormous and lasting. Under Constantine, the whole position of Christianity within the empire was transformed. In the year following his great victory, he and his fellow emperor in the East issued a declaration granting toleration to the Christians and to all faiths, ending the persecutions and restoring to the Christians the property that had been taken from them. And then Constantine went further, throwing the weight of imperial favor behind the once persecuted faith. He supported the building of great churches, including magnificent basilicas in Rome and elsewhere, structures modeled not on the old temples but on the large public halls of Roman civic life, so that a new kind of sacred space rose across the empire. He granted privileges and resources to the Christian clergy. He involved himself in the affairs of the church, even summoning a great gathering of bishops from across the empire to a city called Nicaea in the year 325 to settle deep disputes about the nature of their faith and to bring unity to a church that was still working out what exactly it believed. The faith that had once met in secret, in private houses and hidden places, now began to raise its buildings openly in the very hearts of the great Roman cities, and its leaders, once hunted, now walked in the corridors of imperial power. This was not, we must be careful to understand, a sudden and total conversion of the whole empire. The old gods did not vanish overnight, and for many generations the traditional religion and the new faith existed side by side, sometimes peacefully and sometimes uneasily, in the towns and villages and countryside of the Roman world. In the great cities the change came faster, but in the rural areas the old ways lingered long and stubbornly. so persistently that the very word the Romans used for a country dweller, a rustic villager, would eventually come to mean one who followed the old religion rather than the new. Many people, no doubt, hedged their loyalties for a time, honoring the new god while not entirely abandoning the old familiar rituals of hearth and field and season. But the direction of the great change was now set, and it would not be reversed. Over the course of the century that followed Constantine, Christianity would rise from a favored faith to become the official religion of the empire. And before that century was out, the emperors would forbid the old sacrifices and close the ancient temples, and the great shrines of the old gods would slowly fall silent, their altars cold, their priesthoods dissolved, their sacred places sometimes abandoned to the weather, and sometimes made over into churches for the new faith. For the ordinary person, this was a shift not only in belief but in the very rhythm and texture of life. It changed the festivals that marked the turning of the year. It changed the shape of public celebration, the meaning of the great buildings in the center of town, the way a family thought about birth and marriage, and above all about death and whatever might lie beyond it. It gave rise to new figures of authority, the bishops and the priests, who would come to play an ever greater role in the life of their communities. It was one of the deepest and most far-reaching changes the Roman world would ever know. And yet, remarkably, it unfolded largely without armies and without conquest, carried instead upon the quiet and patient current of conviction, spreading heart by heart and household by household, and then lifted and accelerated by the favor of the emperors. Whatever one believes about matters of faith, the historical magnitude of this transformation is difficult to overstate. For the religion that Constantine raised up would become one of the great shaping forces of everything that came after, in the West and far beyond. Now let us turn to Constantine's second great choice, the founding of his new capital, for it bears just as directly upon the long fading of the West. On the shores of the East, at a place where the continents of Europe and Asia very nearly touch, where a narrow strait of water connects the Black Sea to the wider Mediterranean world, there stood an old Greek city called Byzantium. It had been founded many centuries before, in the age of the ancient Greek colonists, and it occupied one of the finest natural positions in the entire empire. It sat upon a defensible point of land, guarded by water on several sides, protected by a deep and sheltered harbor, and it stood astride the great trade routes, where the roads of Europe met the sea lanes that carried the wealth of the East. Ships and caravans and travelers had passed through it for 1,000 years. Constantine looked upon this place with the eyes of a man who could see the future shape of the world, and he chose it as the site of a new capital, a new Rome to be raised in the East. He poured the vast resources of the empire into transforming the modest old town into a magnificent imperial city worthy to bear his name. He built new and stronger walls to guard it. He raised palaces and churches, a great public square adorned with columns and statues, a vast racetrack for the chariot races that the Roman people loved, above almost all other entertainments, and grand colonnaded streets lined with shops and workshops. He brought in art and treasures from across the whole empire to adorn his new foundation, gathering famous statues and monuments from old cities and setting them up in his new one, so that the new capital gleamed with the accumulated splendor of the Roman world. The city was formally dedicated in the year 330, amid great ceremony, and it took his name from that day forward. Byzantium became Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and it would remain one of the greatest cities on earth for more than 1,000 years to come. Now, pause for a moment and consider carefully what this founding truly meant, for its significance runs deeper than the mere building of a fine new city. The center of gravity of the whole Roman world, which for so many centuries had rested in Italy, in the ancient and sacred city of Rome beside the river Tiber, now began to shift decisively toward the east. Constantinople stood far closer to the wealthiest and most populous provinces of the empire, the old and rich lands of the eastern Mediterranean, where the cities were more ancient, the trade more abundant, the population denser, and the tax revenues greater. It stood far better positioned to face the two most serious external threats of the age, the peoples pressing along the Danube frontier to the north and the powerful Persian kingdom to the east. From every practical point of view, the choice made excellent sense, and it strengthened the empire's ability to defend its richest lands. But it also meant, over the long, slow course of the decades that followed, that the Old West, the lands of Italy and Gaul and Spain and Britain and North Africa, would increasingly find itself at the margins of imperial attention. The emperors would spend more and more of their time in the east, or in cities closer to the northern frontiers, and less in Italy. The ancient city of Rome, though it kept forever its enormous prestige and its sacred memory, as the birthplace of the empire, gradually ceased to be the true working seat of government, and where the emperor was, there flowed the wealth, the attention, the armies, and the care of the state. This is one of the quiet and often overlooked keys to understanding the long fading of the West. As the years and decades passed, the two great halves of the empire slowly drifted further and further apart, not through any single decision to divide them forever, but through the slow, patient logic of geography and wealth and threat. The richer, more populous, better defended East grew steadily stronger and more secure, while the poorer West, facing heavy pressures along its own long and vulnerable frontiers, found it ever harder to muster the resources it needed to defend itself. When crises came, and they came often, the strength to meet them was increasingly concentrated in the East, and the West was left more and more to manage as best it could with what remained to it. The seeds of the West's eventual fading and the East's long survival were both quietly planted in these years, in the shifting of the empire's heart from the old city on the Tiber to the new city on the Strait. And yet, we must remember all of this unfolded so gradually that to the people living through it, the empire still seemed a single thing. However, its rule might be divided between two or more emperors at any given moment. A merchant in Gaul and a merchant in Syria still thought of themselves as living within the same Roman world, subject to the same law, protected by the same great idea, using coins stamped with the images of the same imperial family. The formal and lasting division of the empire into a settled eastern half and a settled western half would come only later, near the very end of the 4th century, in the year 395. When a strong emperor named Theodosius, the last man to rule over both halves of the empire together, died and left the eastern half to one of his sons and the western half to another. After that division, the two halves would never again be permanently reunited under a single ruler. But even then, the people who witnessed it did not imagine that they were seeing the birth of two entirely separate destinies. They understood it as an administrative arrangement, a practical and sensible sharing of an impossibly heavy burden between two young rulers, much as had been done before. Only in the long backward view of history can we see clearly that this was a true parting of the ways, and that from this point, the two halves were set upon paths that would carry them to utterly different ends. The East would endure, transforming itself slowly over the coming centuries into what later historians would call the Byzantine Empire, carrying the name and the memory and the law of Rome deep into the Middle Ages for another 1,000 years and more. The West would fade away within a single century. To understand why the West faded while the East endured, we must now look closely at the great pressures that gathered along the western frontiers in the years that followed, and above all at the peoples who lived beyond those frontiers, in the vast forests and grasslands and river valleys to the north and the east. For the long story of the West's quiet letting go is, in very large part, the story of how these peoples and the Roman world came together, sometimes in war, sometimes in uneasy alliance, and very often in a strange and gradual blending that neither side had ever planned or foreseen. Beyond the great rivers of the Rhine and the Danube, in the lands that the Romans thought of as the wild and barbarous north, there lived many different peoples, whom the Romans grouped together rather carelessly and inaccurately under a handful of broad names. It is important to understand that these were not a single unified nation, nor a coordinated force with a common purpose. They were instead a shifting and endlessly changing patchwork of tribes and confederations, each with its own leaders and its own customs and its own languages, each caught up in its own quarrels and alliances and rivalries with its neighbors. Some of these peoples had lived close to the Roman frontier for many generations, trading with the empire across the rivers, serving in its armies as hired soldiers, absorbing its goods and gradually its ways of life. The border between the Roman world and the world beyond was never a simple wall with civilization on one side and barbarism on the other. It was rather a wide and living zone of contact, of exchange, of constant mingling, where Roman coins circulated among peoples who had never seen Rome, where Roman wine and pottery and jewelry were prized far beyond the frontier, and where the sons of frontier chieftains might grow up gazing across the river at the wealth and order of the empire, admiring it, desiring it, and dreaming of a place within it. And this is a truth that is easy to forget but essential to understand. Many of these peoples did not wish to destroy Rome at all. On the contrary, a great many of them wished above all to enter it, to share in its wealth and its safety, to settle upon its rich and well-watered lands, and to live under the shelter of its long peace and its ordered law. The Roman army had for centuries recruited soldiers from beyond the frontier, valuing their fighting skill, and by the 4th century a very great many of the men who fought under the Roman standards were of such origins, some of them risen to the highest commands, generals of frontier blood who fought loyally for the empire and even shaped its policies. The line between Roman and outsider, between insider and barbarian, grew ever more blurred and uncertain, until it became genuinely difficult to say precisely where the empire ended and the world beyond began. This blurring was nothing new in itself, for Rome had always absorbed and transformed the peoples it encountered, turning yesterday's enemies into today's citizens. But now the scale of it and the pace of it were steadily increasing, and the empire's ability to control and direct and manage this great movement of peoples was slowly weakening. Then, in the later 4th century, a new and terrible pressure came sweeping in from far to the east, a pressure that would set enormous movements of peoples into motion all across the frontier. Out of the vast grasslands of Central Asia, riding fast on their tough steppe horses, came a fierce and highly mobile people whom the Romans called the Huns. They were formidable warriors and unmatched horsemen, appearing seemingly out of nowhere, and they pressed relentlessly westward, driving the peoples who lay in their path before them like leaves before a wind. The tribes living along the Roman frontier now found themselves caught in a desperate vice, squeezed between the terrifying newcomers pressing upon them from behind and the great river frontier of the Roman Empire before them. And so, in growing numbers, they turned to Rome and begged to be let in, to be granted refuge within the empire, to be allowed to cross the frontier and settle upon Roman soil, out of the reach of the dreaded Huns. What had once been a slow and manageable trickle of settlers across the border now threatened to become a flood, and the empire was not prepared for it. One such moment stands out from all the others with particular clarity and particular sorrow, for it shows so plainly how the great tragedy of the West unfolded, not from Roman weakness alone, but from Roman failures of justice and mercy as well. A large group of people known as the Goths, fleeing the advancing Huns, came to the Danube frontier in the year 376 and begged the Roman authorities to admit them into the empire. The Eastern emperor of that time, after some hesitation, agreed to let them cross, hoping to settle them upon empty lands as farmers and to recruit their young men as soldiers, thinking thereby to strengthen the empire, even as he relieved the pressure on the border. In principle, this was a reasonable enough plan, and it might have worked, for the settling of frontier peoples within the empire had been done many times before. But the arrangement went terribly and tragically wrong. The Roman officials who were responsible for receiving and provisioning the desperate refugees treated them instead with cruelty and with greed. They cheated them, they exploited their hunger, they charged them ruinous prices for food, and according to the sources that come down to us, They drove some families to such desperation that they were forced to sell their own children into slavery merely to obtain enough to eat. It is a dark and sorrowful episode, and it reveals how the failures of ordinary men, their greed and their cruelty, in a moment that called for justice and care, could set in motion consequences far beyond anything they imagined, pushed at last beyond all endurance. The Goths rose up in revolt, and the revolt swelled quickly into a full and dangerous war within the very borders of the empire. That war led, in the year 378, to a catastrophe near a city called Adrianople, in the Balkans, where a great Roman army led by the Eastern Emperor himself met the Goths in open battle and was destroyed. The emperor was killed upon the field, and with him perished a large part of the Eastern army, the trained and experienced soldiers who could not easily be replaced. It was one of the very worst military disasters in all of Roman history, a defeat so severe that it sent a deep shudder of fear through the entire Roman world, a sense that something fundamental had broken. And yet, once again, we must note with a kind of quiet wonder that even this terrible defeat did not bring the empire down. Rome absorbed the blow, terrible as it was. A new emperor, the Theodosius we spoke of earlier, came to power in the east, and after further hard fighting he made peace with the Goths, settling them within the empire's borders as allies of a kind, bound by a treaty to serve in the Roman armies in exchange for land to farm and provisions to live on. This too was a kind of solution, and for a time it held together well enough. But it revealed something deeply important and deeply troubling about the changing nature of the Roman world. The empire could no longer simply command the peoples along its frontiers, nor drive them back across the rivers at will, nor dictate the terms of their existence, as it once had in the days of its unquestioned strength. Increasingly now it had to negotiate with them, to bargain to settle them upon its lands, to rely upon their fighting men, and to accommodate their presence within its own borders as something close to independent peoples living under Roman authority. The old clean clarity of Roman and barbarian, of inside and outside, of us and them, was steadily dissolving. Whole nations now lived within the empire that were not fully of the empire, bound to it by treaty rather than by citizenship, loyal to their own kings even as they served Rome, and the empire's fate would come to depend more and more upon how well these uneasy arrangements could be made to hold. For the ordinary people of the western provinces, these vast movements of peoples were felt day by day and year by year as a slowly growing uncertainty, a creeping sense that the protective walls of the empire, both the real walls of stone and the invisible wall of Roman power, were no longer quite as solid as they had always seemed. In some regions, whole communities of newcomers now lived among the older Roman population, settled by treaty upon lands that had once been fully and simply Roman. In some places, this new coexistence was peaceful enough, merely a matter of strange new neighbors with unfamiliar customs and a different tongue, and life adjusted to it, as life adjusts to most things, gradually and without much drama. In other places, it brought tension, competition for good land and scarce resources, and the ever-present quiet fear that the fragile arrangements might one day break down into open violence. And so life in the West went on, as life always does and always must. For the great movements of history do not stop the turning of the seasons or the needs of the body. Farmers still planted their fields in the spring and gathered their harvest in the autumn. Markets still opened in the mornings. Bread was still baked. Children were still born and named and buried. Festivals were still kept. The sick were still tended and the dead still mourned. But over all of it there now lay a lengthening shadow, a growing sense, felt more than spoken, that the world was changing in ways that no one truly understood or controlled, that the old certainties were quietly slipping away, and that the future had become, for the first time and longer than anyone could remember, genuinely uncertain. And so the empire moved, slowly, and without any single decisive moment, into the 5th century, the century in which the Western Roman Empire would at last fade away entirely. It entered that fateful century weakened, but still standing, still recognizably itself, still possessed of emperors and armies and laws and taxes, and the great cities of the West. But its western half was now clearly the poorer and the more vulnerable of the two. Its frontiers increasingly porous and hard to defend, its armies increasingly filled with men whose homelands lay beyond the old borders, its cities in many places drawing inward and shrinking behind the walls they had raised in the years of crisis. The formal division of 395 had left the West to fend largely for itself, with fewer resources and greater dangers than the wealthier East. The stage was set, though of course no one living through those years would ever have described it in such terms, for the long final act of the Western Empire, an act that would unfold not as a sudden and dramatic collapse, but as a slow and patient unraveling, a gradual loosening, one thread at a time, of the great fabric that had for so long held the Western world together into a single whole. The 5th century opened for the Western Roman Empire in an atmosphere of mounting strain, though for a time the empire still wore the familiar outward garments of its former self. There were still emperors in the West, still officials at their desks and soldiers at their posts, still taxes gathered and laws enforced, still the great city of Rome and the other proud cities of Italy and Gaul and Spain and North Africa going about their ancient business. To a traveler passing through, much would have looked as it always had, but the strength behind these familiar forms was steadily ebbing away, like the tide drawing quietly back from a shore, and the men who now struggled to hold the West together were forced to rely more and more upon compromise, upon negotiation, and upon the loyalty of commanders whose homelands and origins often lay beyond the old frontiers. The empire was learning, painfully and by degrees, that it could no longer simply command its world. It had increasingly to bargain for its survival. At the very center of Western affairs in these opening years of the 5th century stood not the emperor himself, who was young and weak and easily led, but a powerful general who commanded the armies and who governed, in truth if not in name, on the emperor's behalf. The greatest of these commanders was a man named Stilicho. He was of mixed origin, for his father had come into the empire from beyond the frontier, from among the very peoples the Romans called barbarians. And yet he had risen through ability and loyalty and a fortunate marriage into the imperial family to become the chief protector and the effective ruler of the whole Western Empire. For many years, through the last decade of the 4th century and into the first decade of the 5th, Stilicho fought with skill and determination to defend Italy against invasion and to manage the dangerous forces that were gathering all around the shrinking empire. He turned back invaders who poured across the frontiers. He maneuvered among the various peoples pressing upon the borders, playing one against another, buying time, patching together the defenses of a realm that was growing harder and harder to defend. By most accounts that come down to us, he was a capable and a genuinely loyal servant of the empire, devoted to the preservation of the world he served, one of the ablest men of his difficult age. Yet the story of Stilicho's end tells us a great deal about the deeper sickness of the times, for he fell in the end not to any enemy of Rome, but to the treachery and fear of the very court he had served so faithfully. His enemies at the imperial court, jealous of his power and suspicious of his origins, whispered against him, accused him of disloyalty, of secret ambitions, of plotting to place his own son upon the throne. The young emperor, weak and fearful and easily swayed by the poison poured into his ears, turned against his great protector. In the year 408, Stilicho was arrested and put to death upon the emperor's order, and in the ugly atmosphere of fear and suspicion that followed his fall, there came a wave of violence against the soldiers of frontier origin who had served under him, and against their families, so that many thousands of experienced fighting men who had defended the empire loyally, were killed or driven away, and a great many of the survivors, filled with rage and grief and betrayal, went over to the empire's enemies. It was a wound that the West inflicted upon itself, one of many in these bitter years, in which the fear and rivalry and short-sightedness within the Roman world did as much lasting damage as any invading army from beyond the borders. Rome, in its weakness, had grown so afraid of its own remaining strength that it destroyed it with its own hands. And so we come now to one of the most famous moments in the whole long fading of the West, a moment that sent a wave of shock and grief and disbelief rolling across the entire Roman world, even though it did not, in itself, bring the empire to its end. In the year 410, the city of Rome, the ancient capital, the eternal city, the very heart and origin of a civilization that had endured for more than 1,000 years, was entered and plundered by an army of Goths, led by their king, whose name was Alaric. The long and tangled path that led to that moment is worth understanding, for it shows once again that the fall of the West was rarely a simple tale of savage invaders and innocent victims, but rather a story of desperation, of failed arrangements, and of tragic mischances. Alaric and his people, the Goths who had been settled within the empire after the great disaster at Adrianople a generation before, had spent long years within the Roman world, and their situation had never been secure or settled. At times they had served the empire as allies, their warriors fighting in Roman armies. At other times they had turned against it in anger and desperation. Always they were in search of the same thing, a secure and permanent home within the empire. Good land upon which to settle and reliable provisions to feed their people. Alaric was not the leader of a mindless horde bent upon destruction for its own sake. He was the leader of a people in search of a place to belong. A people caught in the collapsing and unreliable arrangements of a strained and impoverished empire, repeatedly promised land and payment and official standing, and repeatedly disappointed and betrayed as the promises fell through and the payments failed to come. Again and again over these years, Alaric had sought to negotiate with the Roman court to reach some lasting agreement that would give his people the security they sought. And again the negotiations had broken down, undermined by the suspicion, the inflexibility, and the fatal pride of an imperial government that could neither defeat the Goths in battle nor bring itself to deal fairly with them in peace. At last, worn down by years of frustration and broken promises, and with his people growing hungry and restless, Alaric marched upon Rome itself, hoping perhaps to force the government at last to come to terms, or simply to feed and satisfy his desperate followers. He besieged the great city, and when the negotiations failed one final time, his forces entered it. The city had not seen a foreign enemy within its walls for some 800 years. Not since the far-off days of the early Republic. For countless generations, Rome had lain so secure and so deep within its empire, so far from any frontier, so well shielded by distance and by the ring of legions, guarding the borders, that it had grown almost careless of its own defense. Its walls, though real, had rarely been truly tested, and now the shield of the frontier had failed, and the unthinkable had come to pass. For 3 days, Alaric's forces moved through the city, taking what they could carry, plundering the houses of the wealthy, seizing gold and silver and treasure, and yet, even here, the reality was gentler and less terrible than the bare word plunder might suggest to us tonight. The Goths were themselves Christians of a kind, and by many of the accounts that survive, they spared the great churches of the city and did not harm those who took shelter within them, respecting the holy places and the sanctuary they offered. There was theft and there was some violence, and the sources speak of real suffering among the people of the city. But Rome was not burned to the ground. Its people were not slaughtered in great numbers. Its buildings for the most part still stood. After 3 days, Alaric led his people out of the city and away, still searching, even now, for the secure and permanent home that had eluded them for so long. And Alaric himself died soon afterward before he could find it. And the tradition tells that his followers buried him secretly beneath the bed of a river, diverting the waters and then letting them flow back over his grave, so that no enemy might ever find and disturb his resting place, and the secret of its location was said to have died with those who dug it. The physical damage that Rome suffered in those 3 days was real, but it was not truly catastrophic. The city recovered, its buildings were repaired, its life resumed, its people returned to their markets and their homes. In the plain terms of stone and treasure, The sack of 410 was a serious blow, but not a mortal one. And yet, the wound it dealt to the Roman spirit, to the very idea of Rome, was profound and lasting, far greater than the physical damage. All across the empire, from Britain to Syria, people struggled to comprehend how such a thing could possibly have happened, how the eternal city, the city that was Rome, could have been violated by an enemy. It shook the deepest foundations of how people understood their world. For those who still honored the old gods, and there were many, it seemed a terrible vindication, a proof that Rome had fallen because it had abandoned its ancient protectors, that the old gods had withdrawn their favor from a city that no longer sacrificed to them, and had turned instead to the new Christian faith. And for the Christians it raised painful and troubling questions of its own. If Rome was now a Christian empire protected by the true God, then why had he permitted this disaster to fall upon it? How could such a thing be reconciled with faith? Out of these very questions, wrestled with in the years after the sack, came one of the most influential works of thought in all of the ancient world. A Christian thinker of the age, a bishop in the North African city of Hippo, a man named Augustine, took up his pen to answer the accusation that Christianity had brought about the fall of Rome. And in doing so, he wrote a vast and profound meditation upon two cities, the earthly city of men, of which Rome was but the greatest example, and the eternal city of God. He argued that no earthly empire, however glorious and however long-lived, could ever be eternal, for all the works of men must pass away in time, and that the true and lasting hope of humanity lay not in the fate of any worldly kingdom, but in the eternal destiny of the soul. The fall of Rome, terrible as it seemed, was in this light merely the passing of one more earthly city among the many that history had seen rise and fall, and it should teach men not despair, but the deeper wisdom of setting their hopes upon things that could not be taken away. In this way, remarkably, the very shock of Rome's sack was woven into the deep transformation of thought and belief that was reshaping the Roman world from within. And the meditation that Augustine wrote in response to a moment of grief and confusion would go on to shape the mind of the West for 1,000 years and more. For the ordinary person, the sack of Rome in the year 410 was a sign terrible and unmistakable that the old certainties were truly gone, that the world had entered an age in which even the greatest and most sacred things could no longer be counted upon. If Rome itself could be entered by an enemy, then nothing anywhere was truly safe. And yet, life stubbornly and quietly continued. This is one of the deepest and most consoling truths at the very heart of the story we are telling tonight. The fall of the Western Empire was not, for the great mass of ordinary people, a single terrible day of catastrophe after which everything was suddenly and utterly different. It was a long, slow process, stretching across the better part of a century, and through nearly all of it, ordinary people rose each morning as they always had, and worked, and ate their bread, and worshipped in their fashion, and raised their children, and grew old and died, even as the great structures of the empire above them slowly shifted and settled, and were rearranged. Empires, in the end, are made up of many millions of small and ordinary lives, and those lives went on patient and enduring, even as the empire itself was fading quietly around them. Through the decades that followed the sack of Rome, the Western Empire continued to shrink and to fragment, losing its provinces one by one, not usually in sudden dramatic conquests, but through a gradual slipping away of imperial control. Let us follow that slow loss around the edges of the Western world, gently one region at a time, for in it we can see the whole shape of the fading. In Britain, at the far northwestern edge of the empire, the change came early and came quietly. The Roman soldiers who had guarded the island had already, in the years of crisis, been withdrawn to meet more urgent threats closer to the heart of the empire. And the island was left, in effect, to defend itself as best it could. The imperial government, stretched to its limits, could spare nothing for so distant a province. And so, without any single dramatic moment of separation, Britain simply slipped out of the Roman world. The Roman way of life there, which had never been quite as deep-rooted as in the older provinces, faded away with surprising speed. The towns declined, and in many cases were abandoned. The grand country houses of the wealthy, with their mosaics and their bathhouses and their heated floors, fell empty and slowly crumbled. The use of Roman coins largely ceased. The making of the fine mass-produced pottery that had been so ordinary a part of Roman life came to an end. Within a few generations, the old Roman order in Britain had dissolved almost entirely, giving way to a new and different age of smaller kingdoms and new peoples arriving across the sea from the north. And the memory of Rome faded there into legend and ruin, the great stone buildings of the vanished empire standing empty in the landscape, looked upon by later generations as the work of giants, or of a lost and half-mythical golden age. In Gaul and in Spain, the great provinces of the western mainland, the change came more slowly and took a different shape. Here various groups of newcomers crossed the frontiers and settled, and gradually established their own kingdoms upon Roman soil. At first, these kingdoms often existed within the framework of the empire, at least in theory. Their kings would receive Roman titles and offices, would rule their lands nominally as officials or allies of the emperor, holding their territory by a kind of treaty arrangement rather than by outright conquest. A newcomer king might govern a Roman population, using Roman officials and Roman law, collecting Roman taxes, while himself commanding an army of his own people. For a time, the fiction of empire was maintained, even as the reality of independent kingdoms took shape beneath it. But as the decades passed, these kingdoms acted more and more as fully independent powers, acknowledging the distant emperor less and less, until at last the fiction wore away entirely, and they were simply kingdoms in their own right, ruling lands that had once been Roman provinces. And through all of this, remarkably, much of Roman life continued underneath the new rulers. The Roman population went on speaking Latin, worshiping in their churches, living under versions of Roman law, working their fields and their workshops. The new kings, for the most part, did not wish to destroy the Roman civilization they had entered. They wished to enjoy it, to rule over it, to share in its wealth and its comforts and its prestige. In North Africa, however, the loss struck the Western Empire a far heavier and more damaging blow. And it is worth pausing over, for it shows how the fading of the West was not merely a matter of distant frontiers, but of the very economic heart of the empire. The provinces of North Africa were among the richest and most important in the entire Western world. Their broad and fertile fields had for centuries produced the grain that fed the city of Rome and much of Italy besides, and their olive groves produced the oil that lit the lamps and dressed the food of the Western Mediterranean. This was one of the great bread baskets of the empire, a source of vast wealth and vital supply. And in the year 439, after some years of campaigning, a people known as the Vandals, who had crossed the whole width of the Western Empire from the north, seized the great city of Carthage and made themselves masters of the richest of the African provinces. They established a powerful kingdom of their own upon these wealthy lands, and, being now a sea power in command of excellent harbors, they built a fleet that came to dominate the Western Mediterranean, raiding the coasts and the shipping lanes. Even in the year 455, sailing to Italy and plundering the city of Rome a second time, more thoroughly than Alaric had done. The loss of North Africa was a grievous and perhaps a decisive blow to the Western Empire, for it stripped away a vital source of revenue and grain, cutting off the wealth that the government needed to pay its soldiers and defend its remaining lands. With Africa gone, the West was poorer, hungrier, and weaker than ever, and the sea that had once been a Roman lake was no longer safely Roman at all. Amid all this slow dissolution of the Western provinces, there came one more great threat from the East, from the very people whose westward movement had, a generation before, set so much of the whole crisis into motion. The Huns, who had driven the Goths and others across the Roman frontiers, now rose to become a terrifying power in their own right upon the very edge of the Roman world, united at last under a single formidable leader, named Attila. He forged the scattered Hunnic bands and their many subject peoples into a great confederation, and he led devastating campaigns against the empire, striking first at the wealthy provinces of the east and extracting enormous payments of gold, and then turning his attention to the west. His name became a byword for terror across the whole Roman world, and the sources describe with dread the destruction his armies brought to the lands they crossed. In the year 451, a great battle was fought in Gaul, at a place often remembered as the Catalonian Plains, where a Roman general named Aetius, another of those capable commanders who held the crumbling West together in its final decades through sheer skill and force of will, gathered a great coalition to meet the invader. And here we find one of the strange and telling truths of this age. For the army that Aetius led against Attila was itself made up in large part of the very peoples who had settled within the empire, Goths and others, fighting now alongside the Romans against a common enemy. The old lines had blurred so thoroughly that the defense of the Roman world now rested upon an alliance of Romans and former barbarians, standing together against a newer terror from the east. The two great armies met in an enormous and bloody clash, and though the battle was terrible and its outcome hard-fought, Attila's advance was checked and he withdrew from Gaul. He was not destroyed, however. The following year, in 452, Attila turned instead toward Italy itself, and the sources tell of cities in the north of the peninsula being sacked, and of great fear spreading before his advance, of people fleeing to the marshes and islands along the coast for safety. And there is a tradition that some of the refugees who fled the Huns in these years helped to found, upon the sheltered islands of a great lagoon, the settlement that would one day grow into the city of Venice. Attila's army pressed into Italy, and it seemed that even Rome itself might be threatened. But then, for reasons that the sources do not entirely agree upon, Attila turned back and withdrew from Italy without striking at Rome. Later tradition remembered that a delegation led by the Bishop of Rome, Pope Leo, went out to meet Attila and persuaded him by the force of his presence and his words to spare the city, and this became a famous and cherished story. But the true reasons for Attila's withdrawal were most likely more practical and more numerous, including disease spreading among his army, difficulties of supply in a ravaged land, and the threat of Roman forces moving against him. Whatever the cause, he withdrew, and not long afterward, in the year 453, Attila died suddenly in the night, and his great confederation, which had been held together entirely by the force of his own person and the fear he inspired, swiftly broke apart into quarreling fragments after his death. The Hunnic threat, which had loomed so terribly over the whole Roman world, dissolved almost as quickly as it had risen, vanishing back into the confusion of the steppe. Yet the great movements of peoples that the Huns had set in motion a lifetime before could not be undone, and the damage was already done. And here, sorrowfully, we find the same pattern repeating once more, the pattern that had claimed Stilicho a generation earlier. The general Aetius, who had done so much to defend the West, and who had led the great coalition that turned back Attila, met the same fate as his predecessor. In the year 454, only a short time after his greatest victory, Aetius was murdered, according to the tradition, by the very hand of the emperor he had served, who had grown jealous and fearful of his great general's power and popularity. And once again, the removal of a capable protector left the West weaker still, for there was no one of comparable skill to take his place. There is a bitter and heartbreaking pattern running through these final decades of the West, in which the men most able to defend the dying empire were struck down not by its enemies at all, but by the suspicion and the jealousy and the fear of the very courts they had served so well. It is as if the empire, in its weakness and its terror, could no longer bear to trust the strength that still remained to it, and so destroyed that strength from within, hastening its own end. There is an old saying recorded in a later source, and perhaps too neat to be entirely true, that when the emperor asked a courtier whether he had done well to have Aetius killed, the courtier replied that he did not know whether the emperor had done well or ill, but that he knew the emperor had cut off his own right hand with his left. Whether the words were truly spoken or not, they capture the terrible truth of the age. By the middle of the 5th century then, the Western Roman Empire had become a shadow of the mighty thing it had once been. Its territory had shrunk dramatically and continued to shrink. Britain was gone entirely. The rich provinces of North Africa were gone, seized by the Vandals. Much of Gaul and Spain lay in the hands of newcomer kingdoms that acknowledged the emperor only when it happened to suit them. The imperial government in Italy commanded ever fewer resources, ever less revenue, ever fewer loyal soldiers. Real power now lay increasingly in the hands of the army commanders, many of them of frontier origin, who could make and unmake emperors as they pleased, raising up puppet rulers and casting them down again as their own ambitions and rivalries dictated. The emperors themselves became, in these last years, largely figureheads, some of them capable men trapped in an impossible situation, some of them mere children lifted onto the throne, and then removed again as the true power holders maneuvered behind them. The imperial dignity, once the most exalted and awesome office in all the world, had become a hollow and pitiable thing, a title passed from hand to hand among puppets, while others held the real reins of what little power remained. It is worth pausing here, in the deep quiet of the night, to reflect upon how strange and how gradual this hollowing out truly was. There was no single terrible moment when the Western Empire announced that it was ending, no proclamation, no final battle, no clear and dramatic close. The outward forms of the old state persisted long after the substance had drained away from within them. There were still consuls named at the beginning of each year, as there had been for 1,000 years. There were still officials bearing grand and ancient titles. There were still the ceremonies, and the coins stamped with imperial images, and the language of empire spoken in the offices and the courts. A person living in Italy in these years might well still think of themselves as living under Roman rule, as a subject of the Roman emperor, even as that rule grew ever more empty and ever more dependent upon the goodwill of commanders, whose armies were now the only real power left in the land. History does not always change with a great and unmistakable crash. Very often it changes exactly like this, slowly and quietly, the old familiar shapes remaining in place long after the life has gone out of them, like a great tree that is dead within, but still stands in its accustomed place, its bare branches spread against the sky, until one day a wind comes and it falls, and only then does anyone realize that it had been hollow all along. And so at last we come to the year that later historians would choose, somewhat arbitrarily, to mark as the end of the Western Roman Empire. The year 476. In that year, a commander of the army in Italy, a man of frontier origin named Odoacer, who led soldiers drawn largely from various peoples who had settled within the empire, deposed the last of the Western emperors. And there is a strange and haunting poignancy in the name of that last emperor, a coincidence so fitting that it almost seems the work of a poet rather than of history. For the last Western emperor was a boy, and his name carried within it a double echo of the empire's very beginnings. He was called Romulus, the same name as the legendary founder of Rome itself, the twin who, in the old myth, had raised the first walls of the city more than 12 centuries before. And he bore also the name Augustus, the title of the first emperor who had brought the empire into being 5 centuries earlier. Romulus Augustulus, the sources sometimes called him, adding the little diminutive, the little Augustus, a mocking nickname that captured the pathos of his position, a mere child bearing the 2 greatest names in all of Roman history, presiding, without understanding it, over the quiet end of the Western Empire. Odoacer did not kill the boy. There was no need, and perhaps no wish, for such a thing. Instead, he sent the child into a quiet and comfortable retirement, granting him a pension and a place to live out his days in peace, in a villa in the south of Italy. And there the last Western emperor simply vanishes from the pages of history, his further life and his eventual death unrecorded and unknown to us. A boy who had briefly held the greatest names in the world sliding gently into obscurity and silence. And what Odoacer did next was, in its own quiet way, more telling and more significant than any act of violence could have been. He did not claim the title of Western Emperor for himself, as an ambitious general in an earlier age might have done. Instead, he gathered up the imperial regalia, the crown and the robe and the symbols of Western imperial authority, and he sent them eastward across the sea to Constantinople, to the emperor who ruled there, declaring in effect that there was no longer any need for a separate emperor in the West at all. One emperor in the East would suffice for the whole Roman world, and Odoacer himself would simply rule Italy as a king, acknowledging the distant and now merely nominal authority of the Eastern emperor. And so, without a great battle, without the burning of Rome, without any dramatic final stand upon the walls, the long line of Western Roman emperors quietly came to its end. There was no thunderclap to mark the moment, no single catastrophe, nothing that the people living through it would necessarily have recognized as the end of an age. A boy was gently retired to a country villa. A set of ancient symbols was carried across the sea. A general set aside the empty title of emperor and took up instead the more honest title of king. To very many of the people living in Italy at that time, the change may have seemed almost invisible, scarcely worth remarking upon. Life went on much as it had before. The same fields were worked, the same markets opened their stalls each morning, the same churches held their services, the same taxes were gathered, the same Latin was spoken in the streets. Odoacer, once he was master of Italy, governed it with a considerable degree of stability and good sense, respecting many of the old Roman ways, keeping the Senate in being, maintaining the Roman administration and the Roman law. For a good while at least, the difference between an Italy ruled by a Western emperor and an Italy ruled by a king who acknowledged the distant emperor in the East was, in the actual texture of daily life, really quite small. The great transformation had happened so slowly and so gently that the moment we now mark as the fall of the Western Roman Empire passed by almost unnoticed by those who lived through it. This is why so many historians have come to insist that the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476 was less a true event than a convenient symbol, a marker chosen after the fact to stand for a long process that had been unfolding for a century before it and would continue to unfold for a century after. The Roman world did not end in 476. It transformed. In the East, the empire lived on, rich and powerful and confident, and it would continue to endure for very nearly another 1,000 years. In the West, the Roman ways of life did not simply vanish. The Latin language endured, spoken still by the peoples of the former Western provinces. Roman law endured, remembered and applied and later rediscovered. The Christian church that had grown up within the empire endured and grew stronger, and all of these things blended slowly over the coming generations with the ways of the newcomer peoples to create, gradually and without anyone planning it, the beginnings of a wholly new world, the world we now call medieval. The Roman past did not die in 476. It was folded, quietly and enduringly, into everything that came after it. The ending of the long line of Western emperors in the year 476 was, as we have seen together, a quiet threshold rather than a sudden and terrible cliff. On the far side of that threshold, in the old Western lands, life went on much as it had before, and the great question of the coming generations was not whether Rome would be remembered, for it could hardly ever be forgotten, but rather how much of the Roman world would survive and endure within the new order that was slowly taking shape upon the empire's ground. And to follow that survival gently and with wonder is to understand at last the deepest truth of our whole story tonight, which is that the fall of the West was not truly an ending at all, but a long and gradual transformation in which the great inheritance of Rome passed, altered and diminished, but still alive, into the hands of a new age that would carry it forward across the centuries. Consider first the man who now ruled Italy, the general Odoacer, and the world over which he governed. He was a soldier and now a king, but he was in no sense a destroyer of Roman civilization. He kept the Roman Senate in being, that ancient and venerable body which had endured, in one form or another, for 1,000 years and more, since the earliest days of the Republic. He maintained the whole machinery of Roman administration, the tax collectors and the officials, and the clerks who kept the wheels of government slowly turning. He respected Roman law under which the population of Italy continued to live and began to settle their disputes and order their affairs. For the Roman inhabitants of Italy, the change of ruler did not mean the end of their accustomed way of life. They still spoke Latin in their homes and their markets. They still worshipped in their churches. They still bought and sold in the old forums, still lived in cities that bore the familiar shape of Roman planning, still sent their disputes before magistrates who judged according to Roman law. The one great difference lay at the very summit of the world, where a king now stood in the place that had once belonged to an emperor, and where the army that upheld his rule was composed largely of men whose peoples had come from beyond the old frontiers, and who had now been settled upon Italian soil. Odoacer's rule, however, did not last, for Italy was far too rich and too tempting a prize to remain long undisturbed. From the east in time, there came a new power to contest it. This was a people called the Ostrogoths, led by a truly remarkable king whose name was Theodoric. His story is itself a kind of parable of the strange blending of worlds that marked this age. For Theodoric had spent long years of his boyhood and youth as a hostage in Constantinople, in the great capital of the Eastern Empire, and there, in the very heart of the surviving Roman world, he had absorbed a deep admiration for Roman culture, Roman learning, and Roman ways. He came into Italy at last with the blessing, or at least the willing acquiescence, of the Eastern Emperor, who was glad enough to direct this powerful and troublesome people and their formidable king away from his own lands and toward the west, where they might trouble someone else. After a hard and prolonged struggle against Odoacer, Theodoric prevailed and made himself the master of Italy, and under his long reign, which stretched across the opening decades of the 6th century, Italy enjoyed a period of stability and even of revival such as it had not known for a very long time. Theodoric's rule is one of the most fascinating and moving chapters in the whole long afterlife of Rome. For here was a king of a people the Romans had once called barbarians, who sought, more deliberately and more devotedly than almost anyone before or after him, to preserve the beauty and the order of Roman civilization even as his own people ruled over it. He governed from the northern Italian city of Ravenna, which had become the seat of the last Western emperors before him, protected by its surrounding marshes and its access to the sea. And there in Ravenna, he built and adorned in the grand Roman manner, raising churches and palaces and public works whose beauty still survives. In part, to this very day, their walls shimmering with mosaics of colored glass and gold that blend the ancient skill of Roman craftsmen with the faith and the taste of the New Age. If you were to walk today through the old churches of Ravenna, you would still see, glimmering in the dim light, the images that were set there in Theodoric's time, faces and figures and processions of saints, gold gleaming softly out of the shadows, a window into that strange and luminous evening of the Roman world. Theodoric kept the Roman administration and employed learned Romans of the old senatorial families in his service. He protected the ancient institutions. He worked to maintain a careful and delicate balance between his own Gothic people, who were the warriors and the ruling military class, and the far more numerous Roman population, who were the farmers and the craftsmen and the merchants and the scholars, the keepers of the old civilization. Under his long and mostly peaceful reign, Italy knew decades of order and recovery such as it had not enjoyed for generations, and some of those who lived through it, and some who looked back upon it from harder times afterward, remembered his reign as a kind of golden evening, a last warm and gentle glow of Roman order and Roman peace before the deeper darkness of the coming centuries closed in. Among those learned Romans who served in Theodoric's court, there were men who labored consciously and with great devotion to preserve the accumulated learning of the ancient world for whatever ages might come after them, as though they sensed, however dimly, that a long night was falling, and that the light must be gathered and sheltered before it could be lost. One such man was named Boethius, a Roman of an old and noble family, a man of deep education and philosophical mind, who set himself the great and ambitious task of translating and preserving the wisdom of the ancient Greek philosophers, so that it might not be lost to the Latin-speaking world of the West, which was steadily losing its knowledge of the Greek tongue. He rose high in Theodoric's service, holding great office, But in time, in the suspicious atmosphere of a court where Goth and Roman did not always trust one another, and where fears of conspiracy with the distant Eastern Empire ran deep, Boethius fell under suspicion. He was accused of treason, arrested, imprisoned, and at last condemned to death. And yet it was in his prison cell, in the shadow of his coming execution, stripped of his wealth and his office and his freedom, and awaiting only his end, that Boethius wrote the work for which he would be remembered and treasured for the next 1,000 years. It was a meditation upon fortune and suffering, upon the fleeting nature of worldly power and wealth and fame, and upon the consolation that wisdom and philosophy and faith can offer even to a man who has lost everything and awaits death. In it, he imagined philosophy herself, appearing to him in his cell as a noble woman, come to comfort him and to remind him of the deeper and more lasting truths that no prison and no executioner could ever take away. There is no more fitting image, perhaps, for this whole passing age than that of Boethius in his cell, a learned Roman in a world that was slowly ceasing to be Roman, condemned and imprisoned and facing death, turning the very last of his strength and his days not to despair but to the patient preservation of ancient wisdom and to the search for peace of mind in the face of all loss. Through such men, working quietly by candlelight in the last years of the old order, the deep thought of the ancient world was gathered up and carried, like a small flame carefully sheltered against a rising wind, across the threshold into the medieval centuries that lay ahead, so that it would not be wholly lost, and so that a later and readier age might one day receive it. Again, while the West was thus slowly transforming under its new kings, adapting and preserving and blending the old with the new, the Eastern Empire, that surviving and still mighty Roman power centered upon Constantinople, had never truly accepted the loss of the Western lands. In its own understanding, the West remained rightfully Roman, temporarily held by usurping kings, but destined one day to return to its proper allegiance. And in the 6th century, there arose in the East an emperor of enormous ambition, energy, and vision, who resolved to make that dream a reality and to win back the lost West by force of arms. His name was Justinian, and his long reign is one of the truly great chapters in the whole history of the Roman world, the story of the last serious attempt to make the empire whole again. Justinian dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory and its former extent, of reuniting the lost western provinces with the eastern heartland, of ruling once more, as the emperors of old had ruled, over a Mediterranean sea that was wholly and entirely Roman from shore to shore. And for a time, remarkably, it seemed that he might actually succeed. His armies, led by generals of great ability, first struck at the Vandal kingdom that held the rich provinces of North Africa, and in a swift and brilliant campaign they overthrew it, restoring that vital and wealthy land to Roman rule after a century in other hands. Then they turned their attention to Italy itself, to the ancient homeland, to reclaim the very heart of the old empire from the Ostrogoths, who now ruled it. And here, tragically, the great dream met a harsh and grinding reality that no one had foreseen. The war for Italy, which Justinian's generals had perhaps imagined would be as swift as the conquest of Africa, dragged on instead for many long and terrible years, far longer and far more destructive than anyone had imagined possible. Back and forth across the length of the Italian peninsula, the armies marched, year after weary year, besieging cities and then losing them and besieging them again, ravaging the countryside, bringing famine and disease and death to the very lands that Justinian sought to reclaim and restore. The great city of Rome itself, the prize and the symbol of the whole enterprise, changed hands several times during the long war, besieged and stormed and fought over again and again, until its population had dwindled away almost to nothing. Its ancient monuments were damaged, and the great aqueducts that had watered it for centuries were cut, so that the fountains fell silent and the vast baths stood dry and empty. By the time the long war finally ground to its end and Italy was, for a brief moment, restored to Roman rule, the land had been devastated far more thoroughly by this war of liberation than it had ever been by the earlier, gentler arrival of the Gothic kings. There is a deep and painful irony here, at the very heart of Justinian's great achievement, that the mighty effort to save and restore Roman Italy did far more to ruin and depopulate it than the quiet fading of the empire had ever done. The war left Italy exhausted, impoverished, and emptied of much of its people, and the great Roman recovery there proved fragile and heartbreakingly brief. For all his ambition and all his temporary triumphs, Justinian could not, in the end, make his restored empire endure, for he was fighting against forces far greater than any army. During his reign there came a terrible enemy that no general could defeat, and no wall could keep out. A devastating plague swept through the empire, one of the very worst in all of recorded human history, so severe that it is remembered still by his name. The plague of Justinian. It struck the great capital of Constantinople itself with horrifying force, and the sources tell of a city overwhelmed by death, of the dead carried out in such numbers that the ordinary means of burial failed entirely, and it spread out from there throughout the whole Mediterranean world, carried along the very trade routes and shipping lanes that Justinian's reconquest had labored to reunite, so that the empire's own restored connections became the very roads of its suffering. The plague weakened the empire grievously and lastingly, thinning its population, draining its treasury, and sapping the strength that Justinian had gathered for his great enterprise, weakening it in ways from which it would never fully recover. And the reconquest itself had overstretched the empire, spreading its armies and its resources too thin across too vast a space to hold securely what had been so dearly won. Within a single generation of Justinian's death, much of Italy would be lost yet again, this time to yet another people arriving from the north, the Lombards, who swept down into the peninsula and carved out their own kingdom across much of it, leaving only fragments of Italy under the control of the distant Eastern Empire. The dream of a restored and reunited Roman Empire, so nearly grasped, slipped away once more, and this time forever. And yet Justinian left behind him something far more lasting and far more precious than any of his conquests, something that would endure long after every acre of his reconquered territory had been lost again, something that would shape the world for more than 1,000 years to come. For Justinian ordered that the vast and tangled body of Roman law, accumulated and elaborated over the course of 1,000 years, a great forest of statutes and rulings and legal opinions grown so dense and contradictory that no one could master it, should be gathered together, sifted, organized, and set down in a single, clear, and orderly collection. Teams of the finest legal scholars of the age labored for years at this immense task, and what they produced was a monumental achievement, a great codification of Roman law that preserved the accumulated legal wisdom of the ancient world in a form that could be studied, taught, and applied by the generations to come. Long after Justinian's armies had marched away into memory and his reconquered lands had been lost, this great body of law endured. Centuries later, when a reviving Europe was ready to receive it, scholars would rediscover it and study it in their new universities, and it would become one of the deep foundations of law in much of the Western world, shaping the courts and the legal systems, and the very ideas of justice of nations that Justinian could never have imagined would exist. In this way, the inheritance of Rome flowed onward into the future, not upon the point of the sword, which won only what it could not keep, but through the quieter and more enduring power of the written word, through the patient gathering and preservation of what so many generations had learned and built. And here, in this contrast between the fleeting conquests and the enduring law, we touch upon one of the very deepest truths of our whole long story tonight, a truth worth resting with in the quiet of the night, for it is a gentle and a consoling one. Empires, it seems, may fall and fade away entirely, and yet their truest and finest achievements may endure long after them, carried forward into ages the builders never dreamed of. The Western Roman Empire, considered simply as a political structure, as a state with an emperor and armies and borders, faded and vanished from the world. Its emperors came to an end, its legions dissolved, its provinces passed one by one into other hands. But the things that Rome had truly built, in the deepest and most lasting sense, did not vanish along with the political structure that had housed them. They flowed onward, transformed but alive, into everything that came after. The Latin language did not die when the empire fell. It lived on, spoken every day by the ordinary people of the former western provinces, and over the long, slow course of the centuries it changed and softened and diverged, in different places and in different ways, until it had become the family of languages we now call the Romance languages, the living tongues of Italy and Spain and France and Portugal and Romania and beyond, each one of them a direct and living descendant of the everyday speech of Rome. So that even now, 16 centuries after the last emperor, hundreds of millions of people across the world speak, without knowing it, the transformed and living voice of the Roman Empire. Roman law did not die, but survived, as we have seen in the great codification of Justinian and in the memory of the Western kingdoms, to be rediscovered and studied and built upon by later ages until it lay beneath the legal systems of much of the world. The Roman roads did not vanish, but continued to carry travelers and merchants and armies for many centuries after the empire that laid them was gone, their solid stone foundations enduring long after so much else had crumbled. And in many places, the roads that people travel to this very day still follow the ancient lines that Roman surveyors laid down 2,000 years ago. Roman buildings, though many of them fell into ruin and were quarried for their stone, still stood in the cities of the West, and their forms and their proportions and their engineering were studied and copied and reverently imitated by the builders of every later age, so that the arches and the columns and the domes of Rome would rise again and again in cities the Romans had never known, down through all the centuries to come. And above all these things, the church that had grown up within the Roman Empire survived and flourished and became, in many ways, the great living bridge between the ancient world and the world that came after it. As the imperial government faded and withdrew and finally vanished in the West, the church remained organized, literate, deeply rooted in the lives of the people, and increasingly the one great institution that still held the old world together. The bishops of the cities became figures of authority and stability in a time of frightening uncertainty, often stepping forward to provide the leadership and the protection and the care for the poor that the vanishing imperial officials could no longer offer. The Bishop of Rome in particular, the Pope, grew steadily in prestige and in influence, heir in a sense to the ancient dignity and the sacred memory of the eternal city itself, and the church that he led would become one of the great shaping forces of the entire medieval West, a source of unity and learning and continuity across lands that had lost their political unity. And in the monasteries that spread quietly across the western countryside, small communities of monks devoted themselves, among their prayers and their labors, to the patient copying of books, preserving by hand not only their own sacred scriptures, but also alongside them many of the writings of the ancient world of Greece and Rome, sheltering the flame of that old learning through the difficult and disrupted centuries, so that when a later and more settled age was at last ready to receive it, the accumulated wisdom of antiquity had not been wholly lost, but waited patiently upon the shelves of quiet libraries, in the careful hand of monks long dead, whatever one may believe about the deep matters of faith. The historical role that the Church played in preserving Roman learning and Roman order, and the Latin tongue through the long centuries after the empire's fall, is very difficult to overstate. So when we ask ourselves at the end of this long journey whether Rome truly fell, we find that the honest answer is not a simple one, and that it asks us to hold two truths together at once, gently, in the same thought. On the one hand, something real and vast and precious did genuinely come to an end. The unified political structure that had governed the whole Western Mediterranean for centuries dissolved and was gone. And with it went much of the wealth, the security, the ease of movement, the long-distance trade, and the urban splendor that had marked Roman civilization at its height. In many places across the former Western provinces, the cities shrank, the population declined. The great trade networks that had carried grain and wine and oil across the sea contracted and broke apart. and the material comforts of Roman life diminished, sometimes sharply. A person living in the Western lands 2 centuries after the last emperor would have inhabited a poorer, smaller, more local, and more isolated world than their distant ancestors had known. A world of villages and small towns rather than great gleaming cities, of local lords and bishops rather than a distant all-powerful emperor, of horizons that had drawn steadily inward until the wider world beyond the next valley had become a place of rumor and legend. This was a genuine loss, and it would be false and unkind to the people who lived through it to pretend otherwise. Something beautiful and something valuable did pass away from the world, and yet, on the other hand, so very much survived, transformed and carried forward, that the fall was in truth not an erasure at all, but a passage, a handing on, a long slow flowing of the old world into the new. The memory of Rome remained so powerful and so luminous that it haunted the imagination of Europe for 1,000 years and more after the last emperor had quietly gone. Kings and rulers of later ages would dream of restoring it, would take up its ancient titles and its symbols, would seek to clothe themselves in its borrowed and undying glory. More than 3 centuries after the boy Romulus Augustulus was retired to his country villa, a new emperor would be crowned in the West, on a Christmas day in Rome, claiming to have revived the Roman imperial dignity itself, and the dream of a restored Roman order would flicker and burn on in one form and another through the whole of the medieval and even into the modern age. So persistent and so powerful was the memory of what Rome had been. The idea of Rome proved, in the end, far more durable than the empire of Rome had ever been. And in that deep and lasting sense, one might say that Rome never truly fell at all. It became a memory so bright and so enduring that it shaped the dreams and the ambitions and the very self-understanding of countless generations who came long after it, down to our own day. This, perhaps, is the gentlest and the truest way to understand the quiet fall of the Western Roman Empire, and it is a fitting thought to carry with us now toward the close of our long night's journey. It was not a tragedy of sudden and total ruin, not a great civilization extinguished in a single terrible catastrophe, but rather a long and quiet transformation, a slow and gradual settling of one great age into the next, in which so very much that seemed to be ending was in truth only changing its form and passing onward into the keeping of the future. The empire that had believed itself eternal did not endure in the way that its confident people had imagined it would. And yet, in another and a deeper way, it endured beyond anything they could have imagined, living on in language and in law, in stone and in memory, in the shape of cities and the lines of roads, in the faith of the church and the wisdom preserved in quiet libraries, in the very idea of what a civilization might be and might aspire to. There is a real and lasting consolation in this, if we allow ourselves to feel it. It is a quiet reminder that even when the great and seemingly permanent structures of the world fall away and fade into the past, as in time all such structures must, the works and the words and the patient ordinary lives of those who came before us are not wholly and finally lost. They are carried forward, quietly from hand to hand and from age to age, gathered up and sheltered and passed on into a future that those who first made them could never see. And so our long and gentle journey through the quiet fall of the Western Roman Empire draws now toward its close. We have walked together across many centuries and many miles, from the confident golden height of the Roman peace, when the roads ran straight to the horizon, and the coins passed trustingly from hand to hand, and the empire seemed as fixed as the stars. We have passed through the great crisis of the 3rd century, and the reforms that pulled the empire back from the brink and gave it a longer life. We have watched the founding of Constantinople in the east and the quiet rise of the new faith that would reshape the world. We have seen the great movements of peoples along the frontiers, and the terrible day when the eternal city was entered by an enemy for the first time in 800 years. We have met the last hollow emperors and the powerful commanders behind their thrones, and we have seen the quiet retirement of the last boy to bear the ancient names. We have watched the provinces slip away one by one, and we have seen the kingdoms rise upon the empire's ground. and the last great effort to win it all back by force, and the deep and lasting inheritance that Rome left behind to all the ages that followed after. It has been a long road that we have traveled together, and now, gently, it comes to its rest. The Roman world is gone now, in the form that its people knew and loved. The emperors sleep in their forgotten and scattered tombs, their names half remembered, their power long since dust. The great legions have marched away into silence, their eagles fallen, their roads grown quiet. The vast forums where crowds once gathered stand now as broken columns beneath the open sky. And the grass grows green between the ancient stones, and the wind moves softly through the ruins where a million voices once rose, and yet the old roads still run buried beneath the fields and the modern highways, faithfully tracing the lines that Roman hands laid down. The old words still live in the mouths of all who speak the languages that Latin quietly became. The arches and the domes still stand, or stand again, in the ancient cities Rome never knew, and the memory of Rome still glows, soft and enduring and undimmed, in the long deep story of the world. The empire faded so slowly and so gently that few who lived through it ever noticed its passing, and it left behind so much of itself that, in the truest sense, it never wholly left at all. The last candle in the great and shadowed hall of the Western Empire burned low, and flickered, and at last went softly out. And yet all around it, in 1,000 smaller rooms, other candles had already been lit from its flame, and their warm and gentle light burns on, quietly, even now, even tonight, even here. Let that thought rest gently with you now, in the deep quiet of the night. The great empire has settled at last into its long and peaceful rest. Its striving is ended, its heavy burdens are laid down, its restless ambitions are stilled, and all that was best and most enduring in it has been passed safely onward, gathered up and carried forward into the keeping of all the ages that came after. There is nothing left to fear in the fall of Rome, nothing to mourn too deeply, for it fell so very long ago, and it fell so gently, and so much of it lives on all around us still. Let the old roads grow quiet now beneath the stars. Let the fallen columns stand in peace in the soft and forgiving dark. Let the memory of that vast and vanished world lie easy and untroubled in your mind. The great empire has gone at last to its long rest, its work complete, its light passed on, and now, at the close of this long and peaceful journey we have taken together through the centuries, it is time for you to go gently to your rest as well. Sleep now and sleep well. Let the quiet centuries hold you softly. Let the old world keep its peace, and let its gentle, enduring light watch over you until the morning comes.